this video, I'm gonna try to make a table unlike anything I've ever done before. So I'll be trying this for the first time, and then trying my hand at this. Oh, and some of this too. And you can't forget about it. So this is the basic design of the table without any of the details, and I've split it up into a top and a base. The top will be a separate piece I'll add on later, but for the base, I've oriented the grain vertically and glued up a huge blank, which I began prepping to turn. So this project is my submission to the Rockler Try That Challenge, a challenge hosted by Chris from 4 Eyes Furniture and Sean from Sean Boyd Made This. I've been watching them both for years now, even before the first Rockler challenge, and when this year's challenge was announced, I knew it was finally time for me to enter. If you're unfamiliar with it, the premise of the challenge is simply to build a project trying something you've always wanted to try. And as for the reason of the challenge, well, I'll just let Chris from 4 Eyes take it away.
And I really do believe this is one of the best ways to get better at anything, not just woodworking. Trying things that are just slightly beyond whatever you think your current skill level is.
And I really agree with this message. So much so that I've basically already been following that philosophy for the entirety of my woodworking journey. So when I heard about the challenge, I was pretty pumped since I could basically do exactly what I always do, make the same video, and have my entry. But the more I thought about it, doing the same thing I've always done kinda goes against the entire point of the challenge. So instead, I'm diving into the deep end, trying not just a few, but a bunch of stuff I've never even touched before, with the hope that I'll learn a ton of new skills. The first of which is turning. Now, I have no idea what I'm doing on a lathe. The only thing I've ever turned before is this. It holds a single egg. It was for a weird college assignment, don't ask, but basically the point is I have almost no experience with a lathe or turning in general, and in the spirit of the challenge, or maybe not in the spirit of the challenge, instead of turning a bowl or a pen or something small to learn, I've decided to max out the lathe's capacity and turn a table as my first project. The first thing I learned very quickly is that the tailstock didn't like porous end grain very much. This isn't really supposed to happen. Luckily, I was going slow and caught that pretty early on, so with some double-sided tape, I stuck on a piece of scrap plywood so the tailstock would have something better to bite into. With everything structurally sound, I learned my second lesson. Turning is messy. Really messy. From the few videos I've watched, I knew it made a lot of chips, but I didn't realize within a few seconds I would be absolutely covered. But it's alright, I like the smell of wood anyways. I'm starting off by just getting everything browned, playing around with the lathe and seeing how things feel. If it wasn't clear yet, I don't know what I'm doing, and that's partially why I'm kinda nervous, but also having a ton of fun. See, when you take on something difficult, it can be really daunting. Sometimes so daunting that it paralyzes you to inaction, because you know there are things that you don't know how to do. But for me at least, at a certain point, once something is so unfathomably challenging, it kinda circles back around again to being fun. Because I don't know what skills I'm missing, I don't know what to be worried about, so I'm not really worried about much at all. So before I started this project, I contemplated watching some tutorials to see the best way to wood turn. But instead, I decided to just go for it. In my experience, the best way to learn is just by doing. Now because I'm going in blind, that means I'll have to think on the fly, and this is one of those moments. I have to screw in the faceplate to the end of the blank, but there's not a flat spot to do it, so I'm having to carefully belt sand away enough material to create a flat spot to screw into. What I'm about to do with this is turn a flat face which will become the mating face between the top and the base. I started off with a parting tool, but when I had to change the tool rest position, switched to a bowl gouge to cut in as much as possible. While doing this, I realized the entirety of what I was doing was unnecessarily difficult. Sure, it ended up working in the end, but flipping the workpiece actually worked against me here. And maybe I could have learned this from some video or tutorial, but by making these mistakes myself, the information actually resonates deeper and I get a more full grasp on the reasoning for why a workflow or technique is better or worse, allowing me to apply that knowledge later. To get the parts that were covered by the faceplate, I used the handheld belt sander to quickly level everything out. Then I could rough out a circle on the bandsaw which would become my tabletop, and drill some corresponding holes in the center of the base and the top for a dowel pin. This pin isn't for structure, but rather to help in alignment during the glue up, ensuring things don't slip and slide around and stay perfectly concentric while I add the clamps. I made sure to add a ton of glue to completely saturate the end grain, and for anyone concerned about the strength of this joint, I assure you it is definitely strong enough for this application. With the table out of clamps, it was time to throw it back onto the lathe. Since I didn't want to drill any holes into the top or dent it either, I instead cut out a circle from scrap maple and covered it in double-sided tape and then stuck it onto the center of the tabletop. This could fit into the jaws of the lathe and hold everything perfectly. I then marked out segments every 2 inches on the table, which corresponded to this rough drawing, which had the diameter of the table at each 2-inch interval. And yes, the drawing is very crude, but I pulled all the measurements from my CAD file so I knew they were accurate. And this drawing, even as crude as it is, would allow me to visualize my workflow, which was the important thing. Then I could set up a pair of turning calipers to the diameter I wanted at each segment, plus a little wiggle room. Turn until I was at that desired diameter, and then connect each part with a smooth curve. At the end of the day, I was absolutely covered in chips, the workspace was a mess, but I had the rough shape of the table and I hadn't royally screwed anything up yet. Day 3 of turning consisted of refining the shape down close to what it'll actually be by smoothing out the curves to the best of my ability and making the bottom section flat. I did this by putting a straight edge onto it, marking the high spots, and slowly but surely removing those high spots until the entire segment was flat. After I was happy with the overall shape, I moved on to the bottom of the table and turned in a little ledge to act as a foot and put a little round over on the bottom edge as well. That foot may not seem important, but it actually helps the table to sit flat on the ground. The last thing to do on the lathe was give it a quick sanding just to smooth out all the turning marks, and then it was time to move onto the spiral. I started this by drawing out a curve that seemed to flow how I liked, and I spent a pretty long time erasing and redrawing each part of the curve until I had it exactly how I wanted. I then had to copy this concentrically around the table, and I'm definitely not skilled enough to freehand the exact same curve perfectly 9 times on a non-flat surface, so here's what I came up with. I took some blue tape and wrapped it around the top of the table, cut it to be the perfect circumference of the tabletop, then laid it out flat onto a workbench. I then divided the length of the tape in 10, and marked each section out onto the tape. Then by re-wrapping the tabletop with the tape, aligning the end to the curve already drawn on the table, I can transfer the marks from the tape to the table. I did this a few times down the length of the table, then I could connect the dots freehand to copy that curve as perfectly as I could 9 more times concentrically around it. And I spent a ton of time perfecting these curves and spacing them out as evenly as possible, since these would be my guidelines for carving, and any slight mistake here due to impatience would be immortalized in the final carving. Speaking of carving, it was finally time to start it. At this point in the project, it was looking quite nice. I was surprised that I hadn't screwed up anything major yet, and since I work in a shared makerspace at my school, I was getting a lot of compliments on the table from my peers, and honestly contemplated calling it there, pretending this was my entire plan all along, throwing on a coat of oil, and submitting this as my entry. But something didn't really sit well with me. I knew as soon as I touched a grinder to it, it started me down a path that could lead to everything going wrong, and potentially the entire project being scrapped if I slipped up once. But the more I thought about it, the more I knew it had to be done. I've always been drawn to sculptural furniture, but I've never actually attempted to make any. And the reason for that is fear. For the most part in woodworking, at least the stuff I usually do, you can set things up to ensure that everything will go right before even touching the wood. But with sculpting, every movement matters. Every stroke must be precise and calculated, yet articulated with grace, and one wrong movement can ruin it all. Symmetrical sculpted pieces are especially daunting. Not only does each side have to look good to the eye, but they have to be exactly the same. And with hand sculpting, there aren't many ways to ensure symmetry. But I knew if there was ever a time to get over that fear, that time was now, during a project where I was purposefully throwing myself into the deep end, and because of that, I decided to carve something with radial symmetry, meaning I didn't just have 2 sides to make the same, but 10 around the central axis. I started the carving with a cut-saw medium grit wheel on an angle grinder, then had to switch it up for the tighter sections of the curves. I tried using a die grinder at first, but it felt cumbersome to use and awkward to hold. So I clamped the table sideways in a vise and tried to use an air-powered grinder, but it was annoyingly loud and honestly not that much better ergonomically. I even tried a Dremel flex shaft with a sanding drum, but immediately realized that was worse. I eventually moved on to the tool I knew I should have used from the start but didn't really want to, and that's this Fordham flex shaft with a ball nose cutter. And the reason I didn't want to use it was because after using it for a few minutes, the handle gets too hot to hold, and you have to wear a glove to use it. That turned me away since the glove can be a safety concern, and also I just felt less control while wearing it, but I made sure to be extra careful while using it, both for my sake and the table's. With the Fordham, I could reach better into the narrow sections of the curves, and finesse the peaks between each radial segment, honing them down slowly. Once that was done, the design was really starting to take shape, and somehow I still hadn't made any major mishaps. But the more I looked at it, I envisioned what it could be. The curves weren't as pronounced as I thought they could be, and I knew I could definitely stop here and the carvings would be good enough. But at this point, fear wasn't going to stop me anymore. So I grabbed the grinder and went back at it. I worked the centers of the curves on both the undersides of the top and the bottom of the stem, deepening the grooves and removing most of the material with the angle grinder, then going back and feathering everything together with the Fordham. While I was at it, I also used the Fordham to carve deeper into the tighter parts of the spiral to match the depth on the outer parts. Before I finished final shaping, I wanted to fill in these cracks with epoxy. Little did I know, this would be a huge mistake later. To be honest, I shouldn't have even had any cracks. The only reason they were there at all is because I was trying to get as little wood as possible and I had to use the end of a board. A rookie mistake, really. But since I'm in college now, I've been as frugal as possible and it ended up screwing me over this time. But I had to work with what I had, so I mixed up some epoxy and carefully added it onto the cracks, filling them up as they soaked in more epoxy. As I peeled back the blue tape dam I used, I was relieved to see nothing leaked, but little did I know the problem I just created. See here, around the cracks where it's darker? You may think this is just some epoxy on the outside of the cracks which can be removed with some sanding. But no, this is actually epoxy which has penetrated into the wood, causing permanent color change as it's bonded and fused to the wood fibers. Normally, this would actually be passable, since once a finish is applied, it would blend right in, but with the wood treatment I'll be doing later, that's no longer the case. But at that moment, I had no idea. I was too preoccupied with hand sanding, and I was preoccupied with hand sanding for about a week and a half, so I'll skip over it for you. Before I finished sanding though, I had to fill in this crack that had revealed itself. Now you'll see why the epoxy is such an issue. It's because I plan on bleaching this piece. I wasn't going to make the same mistake as last time, so to do it properly this time, I'm bleaching the cracked part, making sure to get it all the way inside, and then filling it with CA glue. This makes the patch job fill in much better to what the final color will actually be. I then started on the final touches, first throwing a slight round over onto the bottom to create a shadow line on the ground, and then flipping it over to put a matching one on the top of the table. And it was back to sanding. When I finished carving and started sanding, I thought I was ahead of schedule because I had a week and a half to finish up, but at this point, it was the night before I had to be done with the table, and I was still sanding. But at least the vending machine gave me 2 free Pop-Tarts to keep me going. The reason I couldn't go to bed and had to work late into the night is because I had to get the bleaching started to sit and react overnight. The bleaching, like most things in this project, was also a first for me. But it was 5 in the morning, I was exhausted, and I didn't even have the mental space to be stressed. I've never seen anyone bleach their projects before here on YouTube, and that might be a sign that this is a woodworking sin, like staining hardwood, but let me explain why I chose this route. This table is meant to be a couch side table for my living room, and the color palette in that room is mostly gray tone and leans cooler. You can see as I applied part A of the 2-part bleach what the color approximately would have been like with an oil finish, and in my opinion, this color would have stuck out like a sore thumb in that room. When I came back the next morning, everything looked pretty good at first, but as I looked closer, the bleaching seemed to have raised the grain in some areas and made any tiny scratches really obvious. So I had to resand down a couple parts and apply a second coat of bleach. By this point, I had a few hours to complete the table, and I had to choose a finish. This was a little test piece I had with some leftover Osmo oil, and after consulting a few people, it was unanimous that this was the winner. But the winner was no finish, and I had to apply something, so I rushed to the nearest store to find a finish that looked like no finish. I chose this water-based polyacrylic, which claimed to be crystal clear and fast drying, exactly what I needed to get this done in an hour. And sorry to everyone who loves the grain pop and transformation as finishes applied, but I did choose a finish specifically so that nothing would change after application, so in my eyes, this turned out perfectly. Routine leads to the death of growth. Once you reach a certain skill level in something, you tend to take the easy and safe route, doing the same thing over and over again because it's guaranteed to turn out well enough. But when this happens, you stop learning. I realized that recently I stopped learning nearly as much, got complacent with my skills, and stagnated. The deepest form of learning happens when we fall, get back up, analyze what we did wrong, and internalize that to improve. So with this project, the goal wasn't to make the best table possible. This table is full of mistakes. I haven't been shy in showing them. I knew I was going to fail, and I welcomed that, because I knew at the end of it, I would just get better from it. And if I happened to have a nice table at the end of everything, that'd be pretty cool too.